So I'm going to start this by introducing myself, and then I'll introduce our panelists and explain a little bit about what they're going to be taking you through today. I'm just going to just a quick ground rule, and then we decided that it would be best if everyone saved their questions for after each presentation. So we'll be going through Kyle and then Mary and Anne. So after each one, if you have some questions, please enter them into the chat, and we'll get to those. Or if you want to put up your hand and Evelyn sees you, she'll let you voice your questions as well. Hopefully we'll get to everything through the presentation. So again, I'm Kathy Buckworth. I've been with JourneyWoman for a couple of years. I had the distinct pleasure of knowing Evelyn Hannon, who started this business, this wonderful solo travel business for women 50 plus in 1994. I'm actually really good friends with her daughters, but I did get to travel with Evelyn quite a bit. And those of you who know her know that the spirit has been kept alive in this organization by the wonderful Carolyn Ray. And again, she's away right now. So we are doing this tonight. We're talking about ancestry travel. And part of the reason we're working through this, of course, it's of great interest to most people to follow in the actual footsteps of their ancestors. But I had recently written an article as well in terms of how to get started on this, and it raised a lot of questions. I am not a genealogist. I'm a simple writer who had some questions about it and had done a bit of research on my own background. So we have some experts here tonight that I'm really pleased to be introducing you all to. And I'm going to actually ask them to introduce themselves and their specialities, but I'll put them in order here. We've got Kyle BT, who's the Program Operations Manager and Senior Geologist at Ancestry Pro Geologists. And we have Dr. Mary Clark, who's from the African American Genealogy. She's going to take us through that. And we should have Anne Quinlan, who's the founder of Spiral Journeys out of Ireland. So far, we're searching for Anne. We're often on a search for her as she searches for ancestors, but I understand she's coming in any moment. So with that very brief introduction, I'll start this off with Kyle. Kyle, maybe just tell us who you are and to get us into your presentation.
Perfect. Thanks, Kathy. I am an employee of Ancestry, and I have worked for Ancestry for over 20 years. I'm a professional genealogist, and do work for clients in all over the world, researching their ancestors and helping them find out about their family stories. Some of my specialties over the years have included Ireland, as well as Eastern Europe, France, and now my primary focus really within Ancestry is helping people with what we're talking about today in terms of traveling to see where their ancestors came from. So we have within Ancestry, there are different branches or divisions. And in the pro-genealogist division of Ancestry, we have a travel program where we take people to see their ancestral homes on land and cruises and lots of different ways that we try to help people with this journey. So I will jump into my presentation if that's okay, Kathy? Okay, great.
Absolutely.
You can turn to the next slide if you would. So here are just some main points about ways that you can make a heritage trip. There's different things you can call this, and an ancestral visit or a heritage trip. You can, use the word genealogy or roots. It's becoming a very big motivation for people in terms of how they fine-tune their own trips now. And I think it's a really special way to visit a place when you can connect to a specific culture through your own family and get to know those local people through that. In terms of how to start all of this, I'll give you some suggestions about that. And I say, of course, it's always essential to gather all of the information and records that your family may have at home as a foundation. And I think Mary will talk about that a bit more as well in some good detail. And I also recommend building a tree. Online is probably best. And you can, for example, build a tree for free on Ancestry. But building a tree in some form really is an important way of organizing your information and figuring out what you already know, and then look at the next steps for what you want to find out, which is very often those specific places that you're going to visit, and finding records that get as specific as possible really is, I think, what I try to help people to do. Although there are different levels at which you can engage this. So also another thing that's really important is the DNA tests that exist now can really be very useful in helping you have the specific information about, you know, what countries your ancestors are from, what towns they're from, the regions, and knowing about your specific ancestors and their stories. A lot of this can be found with using an Ancestry DNA test, for example. And I'll talk a little bit more about what an Ancestry DNA test can tell you further on here. And then you can think about whether you want to engage somebody who's a professional in some aspect of your trip, whether it's a genealogist or a historian or a guide, to help you with getting really specific about your journey, like figuring out what house did my ancestors live in, and what church did they go to, and really being able to very specifically walk in the footsteps of your ancestors, I think is where the most magic happens. When you can stand on that exact piece of ground, or know that this is what your ancestors saw, and it's you know, like stepping back in time 200 years, 300 years, just by being in that place. But you need to have the information from records, really, in order to have that experience. So that's why all this preparation with genealogy research and DNA testing can be really helpful, so that you don't get to a country where your ancestors are from and wish that you had prepared more to have a specific experience. When I first started going to Ireland, people had told me about, I was going to Ireland to do research and help people with their travels. And I had heard people say that they would observe a lot of disappointment when people got to Ireland and they hadn't done their homework. And it all really came home to me when I was at the National Library in Dublin on one of my first trips. And the person in line in front of me to talk to the librarian said, my ancestor's name was Mary Kelly, and I'm here from America, and I'd like to find out about her while I'm here. And I thought, wow, that's going to be really hard. First of all, because her surname is Kelly, and then Mary doesn't make it any better. But the librarian didn't miss a beat, obviously had heard this many times before, and said, here's a book about the surnames of Ireland, and you can have a read about the Kelly family. But the Kellys lived all over the island of Ireland, so you're not going to be able to get anywhere really by just knowing that her name is Mary Kelly. You need to have done research about those immigrant ancestors before you get there. So you can do this kind of a trip on your own, or as part of a group. You can get help from professional genealogists in one form or another, like making your itinerary or doing the whole trip for you. There's also now the possibility to do trips virtually. That's something that Ancestry has become more involved with recently, because sometimes you can't go, or you don't want to go. You just want to see it virtually from the comfort of your living room, or you have a whole family who wants to see the experience. Like I did one for my family in France a few years back, where I went to the place in Normandy where my ancestors are from, left there in the 1750s, and there were about 100 people from around the world in my family that joined this tour, basically on a Zoom call like this one. So it was an amazing experience that really brought us closer as a family. And I was the only one who physically was in France. And then we have a number of cruises that we've done, and there are opportunities on various cruise lines whether it's on the ocean or on the river, to incorporate this kind of a visit. Like European river cruises are a great example, because you're sailing through the countries that your ancestors lived in, and so it's a really great way of sort of being in the middle of all of it. And then I'd say for what you include on this slide in your tour, it can really be I would recommend that most people would benefit from it being sort of a mixture. You probably should not plan an entire tour that is just about your ancestors and just about genealogy. I'd say, you're going to get tired. Mix it up. Do some sightseeing things because you're there and you want to see those tourist things. I mean, I'm all about don't just do the typical tourist things, be really specific and make the cultural connections, but you also can include that as you go along. And some of the other cultural activities that you find in the country. And you can even do research while you're there to learn more about your ancestors that you've already researched from home. And the next slide, please. There's just a list of some of the cultural activities that you can think about incorporating into your itinerary. Like, there's a lot of different kinds of museums. The museums that are at ports are really very interesting because they help you to know what was it like to come to Antwerp or Southampton or Bremen and then sail somewhere. It's both crossing a continent maybe, but then the process of sailing across the ocean. And then there are a lot of opportunities for things that are living history experiences that are like in Germany. They have many open air museums that you can go to where they have brought together homes and other buildings from the 19th century or the 18th century into one place so that you really can be immersed in what was life like back then when your ancestors were there. So cultural activities is a great thing to incorporate in addition to going to the specific town or village and going to the specific house that your ancestor lived in. Next slide. Here's a list of some things you can do to prepare. It's good to have an understanding of your goals that you've thought through, which things are the most important to you in terms of sightseeing versus history versus genealogy and culture. Also, what things do you most want to make sure that you see on a trip like this, like associated with your family? Like, is it more important for you to see your heritage going back to the 1500s, or is it more important to you to meet some of your living cousins? Or is it some kind of mixture of those two things? Always look out for holidays and when things are going to be closed. Like in Germany, museums are usually closed on Mondays. So, things like that to keep track of, and recognizing that holidays in the countries you're going to visit are not the same as our holidays wherever you may live now. And so that could definitely affect your schedule. Learning some of the local language is really helpful, as well as the languages that the historical records might be in. So if you're going to Poland, you need to know, are the records in the part of Poland that I'm in going to be in Polish or Russian or German or Latin or some combination of that? You obviously can't learn all those languages before your trip, but it's good to be aware, and maybe you'll need some help from somebody to decipher some of those records. Yeah, in terms of things to bring with you, one of the best things I would say is if you have any photographs from your family that are of earlier generations. Their photographs are great things to show people in the towns or cities that you visit. Conversation starters. They may be people that are going to be recognized by distant relatives. So that's definitely something to consider. Right, next slide. Let's just go through these quickly, kind of examples of some of the types of things you can see. A church, a synagogue, or other religious building where your ancestors may have worshipped, gotten married, been buried from. This is one in Sicily. Next slide. the houses where they lived. Again, some Italian examples. You can get very specifically to those exact houses where people lived if you look at the right records. The next slide. Cemeteries. Some people tend to think cemeteries are a morbid topic, but I love cemeteries. I think they're the best thing to visit when you're traveling because you learn so much history from them. But obviously, it's a great place to connect with your ancestors as well if you can find their gravestones. But even if you're in a time period or a place where there's no gravestone for your particular ancestor, there may be cousins buried there or the wider family, and you at least can often tell, well, my ancestors were buried in this ground, and often for a very long time. So that's a really important personal connection. Next slide. Schools. This is a school in County Roscommon, Ireland, that's just still there. Was fun to visit because you can see the fire that they used to keep this one room school. You can see the some of the disciplinary instruments that the teachers used when the kids were not behaving were still there. So you kind of get a sense of what the atmosphere could be like by also looking for things like schools that are in the area. Next slide. And then again, just to look for any kind of local archive, civil registry office, library, or a society that might be there locally that can help you to learn more about your ancestors when you're there. Because I would say, in addition to it being a very rewarding emotional experience to go see where your ancestors came from, it's actually very helpful for your research as well, in terms of researching your family in general, to know the context they lived in, because it helps you think about things like, well, what records would have been made sense to keep for these people? Why were records kept? And just knowing more about their lives helps you to continue your genealogy research. Next slide. Summary of most of what I just talked about in terms of places you can visit. Workplaces are another option if you can figure out the occupations of your ancestors. The nearest market town, because people went, to the market at a certain interval, and they would have seen that place as well as the town they lived in. And then, again, speaking to people while you're there, whether they're local historians or their cousins or just local residents that may know something about your family or the history of the town, or just connecting with people who are there. Because I think as much as it is about connecting, it's also about reconnecting, in the sense that when people left, they often left because they had to. And that created a disconnection that can be restored or healed by going there now and sort of completing the circle. I think the last slide there, maybe. Yeah, this is just an example of what an Ancestry DNA report looks like. And my main reason for showing you this is that I just want to say that because these DNA tests are so helpful for research and for travel, it's important to know that there are a number of different parts of them, of the results that you get. So here you can see there are the regions, journeys, matches, traits. So this pie chart that you see over on the left is what most of us concentrate on when we get a DNA test result. That shows the different percentages of the regions that we have ancestry in. But when you go into something like the matches, where it's listing all of your cousin matches, then you're getting a lot more detail. You're getting specific people who have specific trees and information about your ancestors, and you can really get a finer grain view of your ancestry and the places where your ancestors lived. So the bottom line is just, you can do some further digging that will be really rewarding for both research and travel. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Kyle. That was super interesting. I don't see any questions in the chat yet for you. If anybody wants to put any in there, you can. But some of the things that I love, I didn't know the idea of the virtual tour to me is really interesting because that's a really good point. Not just that you want to take your whole family along, but maybe it's not safe to travel where your
Yeah,
ancestors are from, so you still want to be able to explore
right,
that history. And the goals, it's so important, right? What are your goals? Do you want to meet up with relatives, or do you not want to talk to anybody you're related
right.
to? You just want to know about them. Like I think that's really important as well. That was really fantastic. I've done Ancestry DNA. I'm 98% English within about a 10-mile radius, so I'm super boring. I don't have to go too
Uh-huh.
far to visit all of my tips back to the 14th
Okay.
century. So I'm going to now pass it over, and if questions come in, we can certainly address more questions to Kyle as we come to the end of everybody else's presentations. So, Dr. Mary Clark, I'm going to introduce. I'm going to have you introduce yourself now and take us through African American genealogy.
Well, thank you, Kathy. And I'm just pleased to be here with Kyle and with Anne. I see that she has joined us and everyone. Um, I am African American, yes. What I'm telling you will apply to anybody doing research anywhere. Um, and I'm going to use a story in order to answer a lot of the questions about what it is that I've done, how I've done it, and incorporate some of the things that Kyle has suggested too. I am I'll say a mid-range amateur genealogist. During the pandemic, I met so many other people that know so much more than me. I started myself back at being a baby genealogist because there was so much to learn. And so a lot of times I just refer to myself as a family researcher because many people are frightened by the word genealogist. So let's just consider ourselves today family researchers, and things that I'm telling you, things that Kyle and Ann will share with you, regardless of where you live, they're things that you can apply to your journey as you look for your family. One of the things that has been most helpful to me, even before I knew that I was going to start being interested in family history, was some of those stories that I used to hear when I was a child, some of those things that maybe as a child you were, supposed to be seen and not heard. From my generation, that's what a lot of us were told, children are to be seen and not heard. But as a child sitting somewhere being seen and not heard, I was hearing a whole lot of stuff. And some of that stuff is what has helped me to build my family history. In addition to that, I was just always curious to listen to some of the things that the elders shared with me. And that's another thing that many of you have probably had many opportunities to hear stories of from your elders, stories from your siblings, from your cousins, just family stories. That's a real important starting point in doing any kind of family history. It's those stories. And one of the things as I talk to elders, I've learned that you don't ask them specific questions because they will tell you, I don't know anything about that. But if you open the door to allow them to talk, they will provide so many clues and so many treasures about your family. So I'm going to start sharing my story here. Um, and I hope that I'm sharing the right slide. You never know with uh, you never know. Okay, thank you very much. So I have 4 slides, but on these 4 slides, I have a whole lot of images. And these images are going to help me to share with you a little bit about my journey. So on this first slide, I have 4 images that all begin the starting point of my story at different points in my life. And I'm starting this story in about 1999. And I'm telling you that because that's when I picked up my genealogy research after I completed my doctoral work. And so that's why you see me standing there in my robe, standing on my father's farm, place where I came from, where I'm very comfortable. And behind me in that first image, you see a journal page. That journal page is May 1999. And that was right after I defended my dissertation. But on that page, I wrote something about what I learned from the next person, my Aunt Flora, my maternal grand Aunt Flora. She was a storyteller. And she not only was a storyteller and shared stories with me throughout the later years of her life, she liked to put things on tapes. Some of you are familiar with cassette tapes. She would sit, she would record cassette tapes, and she would usually start it out by saying, I probably already told you this, but I'm just going to share some things from my life. And over the course of probably about 5 or 7 years, Aunt Flora shared with me about 20 tapes. So I have all those tapes that I have had digitized. And so that's where she comes in. And this particular picture was taken of her in 2003. So I'm trying to show how all these people, although they came in at different points, during about a 2-year period, 2 to 3 year period, this is where we were at that point in time. The next person is Oris Jenkins, and this is probably a 5-year-old boy in 2000, and he's playing with his little sister. Looks like he's going to church, and he was very instrumental in my research because I met him during the pandemic. I met him because him and I both have ancestors in Alabama, and we were on a research project together, doing a book. And so that's where he comes into this story. And the final picture is my Aunt Carrie Bell Kyles Weeks, another storyteller of the family. She was mainly identified as the oral historian. Aunt Carrie could talk and tell stories for days. If you didn't stop her, she could just talk forever. And so anytime I had the opportunity to talk to Aunt Carrie, I would have a pencil or a piece of paper and I would just write. And I wouldn't interrupt her until I had to leave because, like I said, she could usually talk for hours at a time. So these are where my story begins. It begins with people telling stories. It begins with people connecting. And some of you may have already identified yourself or been identified as that person in the family that pieces of family history come to you, whether you talk to your elders, whether they give you things like journals or letters, or whether when someone passes away that someone says, well, Mary, I know that you like family history. Why don't you take this box of letters? Um, those are some of the ways that I have accrued things. People have just given it to me because they know that I've been interested. So this is kind of the beginning of this tapestry of family history that comes together. It starts with people at home, people sharing stories. And what our charge is then to begin putting those things together. But you never know at what point you're going to put them together. And so if this next slide will come up. Okay. There we go. Okay. Okay. So usually when you're doing research, you start with a question. And so my question specifically for the past 10 years are, who are Fanny's people? And you asked me, well, who is Fanny? Well, Fanny is the individual in picture number 1 on the left-hand side. Fanny is my great grandmother. Her full name is Frances Eddings Kyles, but she was known as Fanny. And her husband is John Henry Kyles. Why Fanny? Well, from the age of about 4 is when I remember seeing this picture in my grandfather's house. This picture would hang on the wall. And my grandfather, if you look at image number 2, that's my grandfather holding the fish. His name is Joe Kyles. He's standing beside his best friend, Julius Caesar Harper, in front of his house. And I would walk in that front door from the age of 4 until I was 17 years old when he passed away. Inside that front door on the left-hand wall was this picture of these 2 people. And I remember looking up at the picture, and although I saw my great-grandfather, it was something about the image on the left-hand side that intrigued me. I was just pulled in. And after I saw that picture over and over again, it wasn't until I was in my, I want to say early 40s, when this picture was hanging in my mother's house, that I finally said, "Who are those people?" And my mother said, "That's my grandmother and grandfather, my grandmother Fanny and my grandfather John Henry." So I had a name finally. And so I began wondering about her, especially because I was just intrigued with her. Underneath in picture number 3, all of these people in these colored dots are related to Fanny. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. In image number 4 are 4 of my uh, relatives who are now ancestors. I met them at a family reunion in 2010 in Jacksonville, Florida, the first time that I had gone to a family reunion of all of my relatives. My relatives that I'm researching are from Coffee County, Alabama. Um, these 4 women, all of their grandfathers or their father was a homesteader. That's the research that Oris and I, the little boy on the front, uh, were involved with during the pandemic to find our homestead ancestors in Alabama. These dots in image number 3 represent homestead ancestors. Many of them I'm related to that I found during that research with Oris. So how do those relate to Fanny? Well, if you can see the 2 with the yellow stars, those 2 names were on their marriage certificate. So when I began looking for Fanny, I began looking for information about her that I had at my fingertips. And I did find a marriage record. And on that marriage record, Harry Eddings and Peter Eddings were witnesses. Harry Eddings was the person who put up the bond along with her husband, and Peter Eddings was the location at where they got married. And they had the same name, last name as her, but I didn't know, I had not confirmed which one may have been her father. But what I did in the process of looking in my homestead research that I was doing, and I was doing that because her husband and Fanny were homesteaders. That meant they acquired land um, in the late 1800s in Alabama, and they had to have witnesses for their land. And some of the witnesses were individuals that represented what all of these people in these dots represent. These are either witnesses or people with homestead. So as you can see, there's all these things that are coming together about Fanny, but not too much more information about Fanny. So it's a little messy when you do family research. Unlike a puzzle where you have all the pieces right in front of you and you know that at some point after you put all those pieces together, you're going to have a complete puzzle. When you're doing family history, that's not always the case. Sometimes you have to go back and look at something else a little differently. You may have to set it aside for a little while because um, you just get a little cloudy. Um, and there may be things that you may never know. But the beauty of it is you can ask other people. And so that's what I did. Let me go to this next slide now, see if it will let me go to the next slide. Okay. I'm having a little bandwidth.
When I was growing up and the people I knew back then.
Stop. Okay. So, okay. So as part of this tapestry that I'm weaving together, I remembered that my Aunt Flora had sent some tapes, and in listening to her, I remembered that she had said something about some people owning land, and I wondered if was there anything else that she said on there that might help lead me to learn more about my great grandmother Fanny. And so after I had the the tapes digitized, I was able to listen to them and sat and went through them little by little. And under this image one, you'll see this journal entry. And this was that same page that I had on the first slide. On May 15th, 1999, I wrote that Aunt Flora called today, and she has 4 tapes with conversations about her life. Well, one of those 4 tapes, when I listened to it, she shared some information with me. And so this is, again, those conversations that we have with our elders. I want you to listen to this recording, and it's about 2.5 minutes. See how many clues she provides in 2.5 minutes. You want to just take a pencil and paper and just kind of tick mark. Let me know how many clues Aunt Flora provides.
When I was growing up and the people I knew back in those days, there was a whole lot of, well, I won't say a whole lot, but there was a lot of people, black people that owned their own land. Joe Kyle's daddy owned his own land, and there was a group of old McNairs. Old man Mac McNair lived on the edge of, right at the edge of Cleveland. That's where his house, on the edge of Coffee Spring. That's where his house was. You leave and you walk out of his door and then walk a few steps and you walk in the drugstore on the square of Coffee Spring. But he had several children and they had their own land. But he was old Indian, him and his wife. And speaking of Indians, my mom took us to visit a cousin of hers back in, oh my goodness, it was back in 1929, I think. I'm sure it was. That owned their own land, and they built houses for their sons when they would get married. They had 2 sons. Their name was, Mama called them Cousin Handy and Cousin Haley. And they still, both of them still wore their hair, long white hair, then because they was old.
So I'm stopping it right there. So put in the chat how many clues you got just from that 2 minutes that Aunt Flora shared with us. So imagine if you had conversations with your loved ones, with your elders, and you had a 30-minute conversation. That's how much information you can get from those conversations. Let me rush through these other pictures real quickly so I can provide some opportunity for Ann to come on and talk. As Kyle said, sometimes after you talk to people and after you find all the things at your home, the letters and things, you have to go somewhere. That might include going to the courthouses, it might be going to cemeteries, it might be going and visiting people in your land of where your ancestors are from. And so picture number 2 is from a trip that I went to with Oris in Alabama this past December. We went to 6 cemeteries, we went to about 5 courthouses, and when we were walking through the cemetery, just looking at the headstones and calling off the names of our ancestors, I literally stumbled upon the headstone of my great-grandmother, Fanny Kyles, and that's this headstone in the middle. We did not know she was buried there. Burial records did not include that, which is this image number 3 is her death certificate, which typically a death certificate may say where they're buried. This one did not even know that she was married. It had very little information. It did not list her parents. So imagine my shock and awe and gratitude in stumbling over her headstone and that of her 2 daughters during this research trip. In my final slide, I want to just share with you as I weave together some of the pieces of my family's search. This is me in image number 1. I was 9 years old. So at that point, I'd seen my great grandmother's picture about 5 years. But at that 9 years old, I didn't know that I would be looking for her almost 50 years later. The little chair that you see in image number 2 is a chair that sat inside my grandfather's house. After I looked at my great grandmother's picture on the wall, this chair sat in the kitchen. I would go sit in that chair. On the bottom of the chair, it says Billy, 1946. Billy was my mother's nickname. 1946 was when this chair is identified as perhaps being made. I don't know the year, but 1946 was important. Image number 3 is the Black Homesteaders of the South book that Oris and I are contributing writers to. We wrote stories about our ancestors, and my story about John Henry Kyles and Fanny are in there. Image number 4 and 5 is me at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., because sometimes you have to go somewhere else to get original research. And I've made several trips to the National Archives to get homestead records. Image number 6 is Oris and I in the courthouse in Geneva as we looked at our ancestors' information on the pages of the records. Image number 7 is me. I now am the owner of that picture, and I continue to look for clues about my great grandmother, Fanny. And image number 8 represents the tapestry that our family history represents as we weave it all together. It ends out beautiful. It's a little messy to put it together, but a lot of it is obtained from continuing to seek and ask questions. Thank you so much.
I feel like I'm cutting you off, Mary. We could listen to your story for much, much longer, but we should have allowed more time for this. Thank you so much for walking us through. It's a perfect living example of how you can really, as you say, weave together your family's story, and storytelling is where it starts. We know that. And I'm going to shift over now, and I'm going to pass it over to Anne Quinlan, who is joining us. Anne Quinlan is the founder of Spiral Journeys out of Ireland. And maybe you could introduce yourself and take us through a conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, Kathy. And I really enjoyed that, Dr. Mary. Beautiful history, and you've done a beautiful job with it. And I've taken some notes for another time, okay? But thank you. It's lovely to be on. I had a little trouble connecting, but I haven't used Zoom for a while. So, but here I am. So I am obviously Native Irish, which you can probably hear in my voice. I was born the youngest of 5 children to Michael Quinlan and my mother, Lillian Power. So I just wanted to mention some last names here if people are doing any kind of genealogy, but the names in my family would be on the maternal side were Power, Power, and then Russell and Smith. Those were be the 3 prominent names within the family with cousins, Power cousins. My mother's maiden name was Power, and obviously my father's name was Quinlan. And then the Quinlan would be also Heenan and Trainer on my dad's side of the family. The Trainer name is spelt a number of different ways. So my grandmother Trainer, whom I remember, grandmother Quinlan, she would have been one of several children. Her dad died when she was very young, and they were millers. She ended up as the oldest child having to go into domestic service to provide for her siblings. But I wanted to, in connecting with Kathy a little bit in between, and it wasn't possible for me to put slides together. I mean, I have a lot of family photographs, but that would be very boring for everybody, I think, other than what, nothing as magnificent as Mary just showed us. But I want to talk a little bit about the culture in which I grew up. And I think that when Kyle was speaking earlier, I think you were talking a lot about the land. And of course, having been occupied, as we were for several hundred years by our visitor across the pond, it took my childhood my parents would have grown under the British monarchy. They would have been born, my mother was born in 1900, my dad was born in 1904. So they would have come up under that but they also came from families that believed in education. And of course, a lot of that would have come out of the suppression of both Irish language and even Catholicism at that time under British occupation, under the monarchy. So some of those stories, there's many, many stories about that period in their lives, but they both went on to have wonderful families and to have good educations. So I wanted to just touch also a little bit on the land thing, going back to the land, because Irish land is it's a very important part of our heritage. And I have a book here actually written by a wonderful Irish writer, and in the Irish language, he has come up with 32 different names for field, just for field itself. So there are many, many fields in Ireland, and there are many, many stone walls. So traveling around Ireland, and I'm not sure if those of you who are online today, whether or not you've been to Ireland, but certainly as a country, it's remarkable how we rebounded after the occupation. As you probably know, there's still 6 counties within the United Kingdom. There's a total of 32 counties in my country. I'm just going to hold this up here. These are the provinces, and there are 4 provinces. So the country was cordoned off into provinces, and Ulster, obviously. But part of Ulster, I was born in Ulster. I was born in the province of Ulster, but in the Republic of Ireland, which is just a very, very short, almost, we used to ride our bicycles across the border when I was a child with my brothers, and we would fly through the customs, and they'd yell at us, and then they knew my dad, so they would say, "Oh, it's just Mick Quinlan's kids, let them go." But in those days, the border was a really hard border, and I think, as you probably are aware now, that has opened up since the wonderful peace accord, which is now celebrating, I think, 27 years this year, or 28 years. So I'm in just going through the family names. The reason I mention that is that many Irish names obviously were anglicized, or the original name that would have been in Irish. My name in the Irish language is, I am Anya, which is Anne, A-N-N, but it's Anya Ní Cínlán. Women are given the Ní, which means of the clan of Quinlan. The boys are given O. So my brothers would be Mícheál Ó Cínlan. And so starting off in school, we certainly had Irish language and learning the Irish alphabet and things like that. I am not an Irish speaker, regrettably. I had to obviously study it and did all my exams in the Irish language over my education over there. I mentioned a couple of things to Kathy with regard to I think there's some interest in the mother-baby homes. And I'm just going to move on to that now, because anybody who's searching for their Irish history, and many of these mother-baby homes, as you probably know, and you can certainly go online to Ireland and you can look up different information through the Irish government, where they've now opened up a lot of those records. But I wanted to address that because it's more than just a shameful period in Irish history. I mean, we were not the only country with mother-baby homes, but the only country that I know about is my own country. And so many of those babies were actually adopted out. They were adopted out. Many came to America, and this is where the diaspora here many of the young babies who were adopted or eventually given the name of the adopting family. I don't know how that research is being done from America, but records have opened up a lot more in Ireland around that particular period in time. But again, I go online periodically, and the adoption, and then the older people who have finally maybe located a sibling through DNA or a cousin through DNA, then they're able to sort of sort of reignite their birth story and to find out, you know, what home they were in, or, you know, were they given away as babies? Were they, and there's a lot of backstories on this that I could just write a book about. And it was a very shameful, tragic period in those babies' lives. And I don't know if you've been following the story of Tuam, Tuam, which actually means tomb, and the woman who has uncovered the burial site of children. They're now doing excavation on that, and they're working on about 130, I think, baby bones down there of different infants who were buried in a septic system. And they're now working on doing DNA and trying to figure out who these babies were. They had lists of the names of these babies, because the one thing the nuns did and the Catholic Church did, they kept good records. And that's one thing you will find in Ireland. Somebody was mentioning earlier about locating, going to grave sites and going to, you know, churchyards and places like that where you might find. But the one way to start, if you're researching, I would definitely suggest parishes. There's about 300, maybe close to 400 different parishes in Ireland, and a parish would be within a diocese, and a village would have its own parish, or they would have their own cemetery. And Kyle, probably, if you've been there, and I think Kathy, you've been there. So locating the village, the name of the village, if you have that information. The other thing obviously would be, if you're researching Ancestry, certainly passenger liners going all the way back to the 1700s. There are different talks that I do on the history of that migration, or people just migrating to the United States going back from the 1700s. Many of those ships went down, people were drowned, but also they were also the famine ships. So people were jumping on board because of the Great Hunger. And that's another tragic period in Irish history as well. The other thing is there's an organization, I think I sent you the link to this, Kathy. It's called the Wild Geese. And the Wild Geese obviously were Irish soldiers who went off and they fought on the continent, basically. They fought in Spain for Philip. They fought throughout the European continent. And so this would have been young men leaving, and this would have started around the 1700s. So the Wild Geese is a website started by Jerry Regan, and it's very interesting because there are diaspora and descendants who are on that website who would have been descended going back to the 1700s. And he has not clients, but people who are members who live in parts of South America, Central America. So we Irish are everywhere. We're all over, basically all over the planet.
So there's something like 70 million Irish spread amongst who claim Irish descendancy. Some massive number.
Well, certainly in this country, and I don't have the total number of but again, looking at probably 3 periods in Irish history, under the monarchy, because we were basically hungry, and we were. I want to go back a little bit earlier. Sorry, I mentioned to you about the Brehon laws, and the early Brehon laws predated. They were up from about 300, 200, 300, up to, and they're still, if you go to law school in Ireland, you are required to study Brehon law. And these were laws of equality for men and women. But the name Brehon means judge. So a person would be chosen in a village. And this would go back to, they found very early forms of Irish archivally, and Trinity College has a lot of information on this. And so the Irish language back then sounds like almost a totally different language to the Irish we have today. But that was the language spoken. And when the Elizabethans came, of course, in the 16th century under Henry, then everything changed. But was interesting that the Elizabethans began to try to usurp some of the laws that existed within the Brehon laws. And I would encourage you to look up Brehon. It's Brehon. And Brehon, again, meaning judge, but it's a fascinating period in Irish history. There's in Kilkenny, there's a Brehon University that still has, they still study Brehon law. And I think the history of that is pretty interesting, given that we were then everything kind of came to not to a complete halt, because we were still Irish people, but when we were occupied, and then a lot of our land was taken over. One of the
And I really, really hate to do this. The moderator's job is never easy. We
Yeah.
are within 2 minutes of finishing. I know that yourself
Oh,
and
okay.
Mary and
Okay.
Kyle you're all very passionate about this,
Yeah.
and I love it. And we should have scheduled an hour each for
Oh,
all of you,
yeah.
because what you're saying is so wonderful. And I hope that you'll all take the opportunity to go through the group chat questions. It'll be included in a summary,
Yeah.
because we didn't get a chance to do our round table. I think what we've learned here today is that, again, we're also passionate about our own history and our story. It's all storytelling. It's something that we really need to do personally, I think, for ourselves. And Cal has given us great tips on where to start. And Mary gave us this very personal journey, which I loved so much, her own personal journey. And then Anne, yes, the Irish history. I mean, it's massive, and there's so many moving parts to it that people can explore. The Epic Museum, a few people have mentioned in the chat. I've been there
Yeah.
twice
Yeah.
myself. It's amazing. I'm not even Irish, and it's fantastic. Does anyone have a last word? Because I know we're going to get cut off our Zoom call. This is an hour chat. You can find it on our YouTube channel. This whole conversation, if you've missed any final words, Kyle, and I'll pass it to each of you.
Oh, thanks everyone for joining. Great questions. Ancestry's there. If you need assistance with anything, we're happy to chat with you. Thanks very much, Anne and Mary. Very, very interesting
Thank you.
storytelling they
Thank
have
you.
there.
There's
And
more.
Mary, any final words to everyone?
I just say, just start with yourself and get those stories and write them down and share them with your family.
Yes, yes.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And Anne?
Thank you, everyone. Yes. Yes, I would urge you to definitely passenger liners, and look for those passenger lists. And that can go all the way back to the 1700s, but even the more modern, like the Cunard line, the White Star line, those are passenger lists are very, very valuable. People went in whether you were first class or all the way down in the bilge. Those passenger lists are still available, and it's a way to research possibly people who came in through New York or came down.
My parents came on a White Star Line from England, actually, over to Montreal, actually, originally. So yep, you're absolutely right. So again, sorry, I'm the meanie here, but I'm cutting everybody off. This was a wonderful, wonderful chat. Thank you so much for your time, everyone who listened in and weighed in on the side.
I love it.
Fantastic idea, and we'll do more of it. I think I'll certainly talk to Carolyn about the huge interest that we have in this. Thanks, Evelyn, for doing all the technical work on it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for joining.